Okay, we're going live.
Beautiful. Let's do it.
All right, we're good. Oh man. So sorry about that, Ben. I really apologize for the delay here. I had some issues on my end. We are live now. Ben, thanks for getting on the call. Show live. I don't know what you call these nowadays. These little chat rooms. There are some people that are on, so we'll just say hi to them really quick. But Ben, again, pleasure to meet you, or pleasure to see you on. Yeah, I mean, I think just to kind of start things off, you want to share a little bit about yourself, give us a little bit about your background, and we can go from there.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Charles, and thanks for having me on and putting this together. Always difficult with the technical issues, and you just kind of forge on, and it's business as usual in this COVID world. Apologizing in advance from the tomato filter that I seem to put on myself through Zoom. But my background, I came out of uni studying business law and economics. So I bounced around and did a couple of sort of more relationship and sales-based roles for a number of years. Worked in IT recruitment for a while and found myself really sort of warming to the technology side of the job and started delving in perhaps a little bit more deeply to sort of candidates' backgrounds and what they were doing day to day is perhaps what was required from my role. And an opportunity came up with my current employer, Ozpost, who were trialing this program called the Tech Academy, where they took people, 20 of us from different backgrounds, and they put us in a boot camp for 3 months and taught us sort of basic scripting Python skills related to things like networking, agile software development, security, all these bits and bobs. And after that those 3 months, they then pushed us out into the business, where we rotated through a series of different roles. So I've worn a couple of different hats at Post now and settled in the realm of cloud security engineering, which for us encompasses probably two broad aspects. One is building products that are secure by default and pushing those products out for shared use for different teams throughout the organization. And then also working closely with the cybersecurity office to make sure that they have all the tools and the technology they need in order to make sure that they're capturing all the logging and monitoring requirements that they have and making sure that we're staying on track as an organization.
Awesome, Ben. There's a lot to unpack there, so I want to take it bit by bit because
sure.
It's a really interesting journey you went through. I mean, if you think about it, there's very few that become part of like basically it's a boot camp. It's a coding boot camp, right? Within an organization, then get placed into cloud security. And in all of this process, like, if you look back, hindsight is 2020, but it makes a lot of sense, right? Now with what cloud security is today and what you need to do, coding bootcamp makes a lot of sense for someone who wants to get into it. But I mean, these are the things that Gartner loves talking about. Oh, you need to train people internally. You need to retool them. You need to train them all on all the new things to get them on board, up to speed with what are the latest things in security, right? And, I got to be honest, like I haven't heard of a lot of organizations doing this type of coding bootcamp or willing to do that. You want to share a little bit about that experience? Like, first of all, like, how did they recruit you? How did you onboard? What was that experience like going through the academy? And then what got you into cloud security? Because you mentioned you tried a couple other things, right?
Yeah, sure. So as far as the application process, there was, as you can probably appreciate, there was a huge amount of interest stemming from it. And so there was a series of sort of screening-based questions, written-based questions, which coming from a recruitment background tends not to hurt your chances at knowing on what they might be looking for on that front. There was some video interviews that were done. And then there was a half-day sort of assessment center, if you like, with a series of problems. And that was everything from sort of rapid fire interviews, group presentations, single person case studies. We were divided into groups of sort of 10 or 20, and we were given we were asked to build a spam filter out of Python. And we were given sort of, 4 or 5 pages of, this is how you build a for loop. This is the business logic it needs to entail. You can work as a group, and that's all the advice we're going to give you. Off you go, which was a pretty humbling exercise. And you come away from that and go thinking, geez, why on earth would I want to be a software engineer? But, from speaking to the people running that, it was less about whether you got the right answer and more about the way in which you actually went about it. And so things like you were given the option to work as a team, so work as a team, the ability to reach out and ask questions, which when you've only got 3 months worth of bootcamp experience, those are 2 things that you're really going to need to be comfortable with when you're operating in a high-performing enterprise team. And so that's really what they were looking for in that exercise, rather than any degree of sort of coding excellence that came from that. As far as my experiences in moving through that program, I was fortunate to try my hand at some very different teams. So I worked in integration services for a while, then I worked in automation and orchestration teams for a while, then I worked in a traditional security analyst, which was probably akin to a SOC type role, to where I am now. So the breadth of experience that I was able to gain across different roles, where if you were to just get a job at a company, you'd never get those opportunities to be able to wear those different hats and experience those different lenses that people look through. And I think the other thing is that you just needed to be comfortable with not knowing everything 100% of the time. You had to become comfortable with being uncomfortable and diving in the deep end. And that was something that was challenging for me as someone who was quite analytical and a bit of a perfectionist, to not fully know what you were doing, but to be able to know enough to find the answer yourself. And that's where Dr. Google came in, and your colleagues came in as well. So yeah, it was an amazing experience for me.
Just out of curiosity, I mean, so you've tried a lot of different paths. Before you did cloud security, you did automation. I don't know what that meant. Automation and orchestration. You've
Yep.
worked on helping with teams retool with their existing eco. The question I have is what would you say is the right mentality going into cloud security? Because they're all different realms, and being a SOC analyst is a very different approach. They look at things differently, right?
So when you say what mentality to go in with, what sort of lens do you apply to cloud security?
Exactly.
Well, I think it depends, and that's what's important when you're carrying a message, is that when you look at an enterprise and when you look at these delivery teams, everyone has different sets of priorities. And what might be important to one group is going to be not of interest in the slightest to another group. And I think one of the things that stood me in decent stead is coming from a sales background and from a relationship management background. You need to learn to tailor your message based on the stakeholder that you're working with. And so I think the lens is always going to be different based on that.
That's a lot of wisdom there, because I think that is the harsh reality. Everyone that looks into cloud security, they all have this, a lot of times, especially on the vendor side, we push a particular lens, right? As you call it, a particular perspective. But within the organization, within each team that you're working with, they look at cloud security as fundamentally a lot of different things, right? And we can unpack that. And I want to talk about how the business interprets cloud security. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate you sharing that. Okay, so thank you so much for your background. Now the main premise of this webinar typically is talking a little bit about what is your day-to-day operation, and it all starts with what's part of your development toolchain. What do you use? What are you using regularly? What would you recommend if you're working on any project with cloud security? What are some resources you use regularly inside Dr. Google?
Yep.
Yeah.
Sure. So old habits die hard, and Python's just the scripting language of choice for me, but not really wedded to it for any reason in particular. It's just the one that I've sort of used the most. But Python, Ruby, Bash, PowerShell, depending on sort of where the situation demands it. As far as sort of repositories of choice, GitHub for sort of more of my personal projects, GitLab I've used, Bitbucket I've used as well. Much of a muchness, I think, between those, depending on the sort of the features that you're using. And then sort of my deployment methodology and the tooling that I use around that. We use something called the Three Musketeers pattern, which is the Three Musketeers are Docker, Docker Compose, and make files. Make files just as a way of orchestrating these series of deployment actions. And the containerization piece makes it really easy to make that result able to be replicated across different environments just by virtue of hosting it within that container. So that's kind of what I use day to day. There are times where the AWS native deployment tooling and deployment methodology works quite well. So code build, code commit, code pipeline, whilst not being the most fully featured CI/CD tools, there are times when it's more convenient to use those as sort of a packaging layer and a way to push down individual config within an account, say, as an example. That becomes quite handy. So it kind of depends. You find yourself flittering around a little bit. There's always open source tools and things on GitHub that you find yourself sort of rolling out and using where you can as well.
Yeah, I think, and this was in the previous webinar too, but like a lot of times when we talk about tooling, there is no holy grail of tooling that fits every single use case, right? And the reality is, within even the same organization, in each service there might be some use cases. So when you mentioned code pipeline, in my head I was thinking, well, this person probably doesn't want to access, say, external GitHub within this service, right? And they don't want to run Jenkins externally or something like that, right? There might be some other reasons behind this, and that's what was processing my head, because, well, it can make sense. It depends on what the situation is. So I totally get that. Okay, awesome. Now, and this gives a little more context about how you and I met, but I remember when I first found you on LinkedIn, and you were talking about how you're integrating the AWS Access Analyzer API to kind of inform people as they're writing their CloudFormation templates, what IAM roles, what are the best practices for IAM according to AWS. By the way, for those who haven't looked at the API, it is amazing what it can provide. It's just, it's all managed by AWS, but we'll send a link later if you guys want. But, that was a couple months ago. Obviously you manage and maintain that, but what are some of the latest challenges you run into now? What are the things you're working on right now?
I think from a technical perspective, identity and access management is something that could just keep you busy for a lifetime. The goalposts are always changing. The APIs that are available are always improving, and particularly in AWS, where you have so much control over you know, even identity and access management as a concept, where you have, should someone be able to access this, yes or no, these sort of authorization and authentication conundrum. You know, you have identity and access management, you have SCPs, you have bucket policies, you have object and bucket ACLs, you have KMS policies, you have SQS, SNS. That's just a never ending game where you're constantly asking the question, are we doing this as well as we can? Are the teams up to date with the latest understanding coming from the Twitter sphere on what the best way to go about this is? So I think that's one piece that's constantly keeping me busy, and the policy validation coming out of IAM was a component where we thought this is a great way to give real-time feedback in pipelines to say, right, you know, this region isn't available, or you're using IAM pass role with resource star. That's probably not a great way to go about things. You know, it's just a great way to provide that back to teams, which kind of feeds into the next conundrum, which is scalability. It doesn't matter how well resourced your information security department is, there are always going to be more developers than security professionals. And making sure that our operations and our day-to-day tasks are scalable, so that no matter how much we build and what we're doing, we are able to continue to build on that in a way that doesn't just chew up our BAU to the point where we either need to bring another person on board, or we just never build anything new ever again, really. And then the last point is kind of around what we touched on earlier, which was making security relevant. And that's just an ongoing discussion that you have with people, and it's about changing your message. It's about changing how we quantify risk and how we quantify threats in a way that doesn't pose security as a blocker, but as a partner. So whether that's shifting design further up to the left, apologies for anyone who's playing buzzword bingo or a drinking game at this point, but you know, making sure that security architecture has their hands on these things at the start, not 2 weeks before the deadline, going, what on earth are these people doing, is going to go a long way to making sure that a lot of these sort of basic security hygiene principles are met.
Yeah, I got to be honest, I was trying to avoid using buzzwords like DevSecOps, shift left, but you know,
I'll do it.
I didn't say anything, right? But anyways, this is an interesting problem, right? And I think at least on the vendor side, we like to talk about it all the time. But the interesting challenge is you touched on it, like the balance between productivity and introducing security. And it's always been a weird dichotomy of like, oh, well, security kind of slows us down and we'll never build stuff and right? And you know, from the business lens, it is hard to think about how you implement security practices, because there's always something new coming out, right? Like, as you mentioned, just looking at IAM, you might not have realized it, or you might not have discovered it, but there's a new loophole around the APIs and how, you know, the KMS can be exposed publicly, right? Whatever, right? And this is an ongoing topic. It's, you know, ad nauseum. Everyone wants to try to figure out how secure is our environment and what can we do about it. And you know, from the business perspective, you know, it is important, obviously, to minimize the risk, but then at the same time, it's like, wait, are we going to stop everything we're doing to address this item and then proceed? Like, you know, we can't do that every single time, because, well, there's a lot of items that always come up when it comes to security, and that's how it should work, right? That's how security should continue to optimize and identify these problems. But what's your perspective on this? Because you mentioned you got to, you know, kind of talk about it in the right lens and how the business interprets it. Like, how do you approach those problems when you identify there's a new problem to solve, want to introduce something into or implement something as a security strategy, and then you bring it up to the business? How does that play out? I think
the first problem, or the first step is always about getting the right people in the room. And I sort of come into it from perhaps more of a practical element of how could this be done? But then it becomes much broader than that of, okay, how do we quantify the risk? And that's where, stakeholders like security architecture and governance, risk and compliance come into the conversation to say, all right, what's our risk palette? What does this look like? And then it becomes a bit of a balancing act between all of those different stakeholders along with the business to understand what it is we're going to act on and what's reasonable in order to do that. And you're right, you're never going to be able to plug every single hole. And, there are constantly, security is a constantly changing environment. And so it's, you're going to plug one and another two are going to appear tomorrow. It's inevitable. So it's about getting the right people in the room. And I think making people aware of that. I also think that security in the last, and this is probably a mildly uneducated opinion from myself, but just from the reading in the last 2 years relative to what's been produced in the past, I think security's come a long way in quantifying cybersecurity incidents in terms of money. And I think that ransomware has a lot to do with that, because it's placed a dollar figure on what some of these business decisions unfortunately mean for these enterprises, where a discussion has happened between these groups and a decision's been made, and ultimately 6 months, 12 months, 18 months down the track, it's cost them because they've elected not to do something, and an incident's occurred and there's been a dollar figure slapped on it.
Yeah, I think whenever there's dollars tied to some sort of security risk, it's a lot easier to quantify. It definitely is. And ransomware, I hate to say it, it is a low hanging fruit to quantify it, right? It's definitely true. I want to kind of move into a different direction here, because as we talk about this, I want to kind of explore another topic here that's adjacent, but it's, what is your framework when you approach new problems to solve? Because, we talk about this, but do you go to sleep thinking about like, oh, where are the loopholes in our IAM policies? Is that the reality? Or, can you kind of describe, like, how do you go about your day thinking about, oh, this is something I need to tackle, and this is something we need to bring up to the business? Do you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think in terms of the sources of inspiration, the reality is that most organizations aren't solving a problem by themselves. If one organization's got it, odds are someone else has got it. And one of the things that's great about the cybersecurity and cloud security community is that people are quite open to sharing their learnings, following the ticks off from legal and all that sort of thing. But that you find a lot of these articles on things like Twitter and GitHub. I think that there is a lot of value in bringing an offensive and red perspective to my role. And I wouldn't necessarily call it threat hunting, because I think that makes it sound more scientific than what it is that I do. But there are times where, say for instance, I'll deploy a new SCP or something like that. And then it's just a series of what if questions where I go, okay, there's now a hole in my SCP and I've found it. Putting on the hat of, if I was malicious, how would I go about this? I think brings a lot of value. And I think a lot of organizations have come away with some great learnings out of purple teaming exercises. Whereas for me, I'm on the blue team, but I can wear that hat and I can feed those learnings back to myself. And I think that really helps in terms of providing that feedback loop for what it is that I'm doing.
Yeah, you made an excellent point. Threat hunting it's a whole other realm, and people dedicate a lot of their time doing that. But if I were to paraphrase for me to process it, you look at the problems or the services that you deploy, and you think, what are the holes, what are the gaps in here from a security perspective, and how can they be handled, addressed, and how bad are those holes, right? And having that offensive mentality always is a really healthy thing. I got to be honest, like, I'll tell you internally, like when we were building a feature like single sign-on, the engineering team actually brought it up to me, like, hey, this is how someone can potentially hijack an SSO configuration from someone else. And it was very fascinating to watch that, because the engineering team wanted to be secure, and they brought it up to me. And first of all, I didn't think through the potential implications of publicly exposing SSO configurations for all web, all instances of our web-based application, right? Because people can squat.
Yeah,
it's interesting. Not a lot of people talk about the problem of squatting with user credentials, but I think there's a lot to explore there.
yeah. I think like where I sort of come into it is, I bring the practical element to it, and then you bring the right people into the room. You bring architecture, you bring governance, and you bring business, and you sort of lay it down. You go, right, this is what it is, and this is what could happen. You discuss, and then you just sort of sit back and you answer any questions that people might have. I don't feel that I have quite the level of perspective, and I don't think that's what I'm employed to do, to be able to make those business calls. All I can do is put the facts on the table, present a scenario, and then not walk away, but that's kind of how it is.
But there's a healthy balance there, because a lot of times you can't be judge, jury, and executioner, and that's not healthy either, right? And then having those divisions kind of helps balance out, well, the person that has to weigh risk needs to factor in a lot of other things that they're overseeing, not just this particular whole, right? So to speak. So it's I think there is a healthy balance with that. It was actually fascinating for me to hear that, like, the security team, you work and you partner with the security team, but it's effectively different in terms of the teams that you work with. And we, this is getting pretty common now, like cloud security rolls into development, architecture, other teams, right? Is there like a use case for why that was laid out? Do you have any opinions on that?
Yeah, look, from my understanding, and granted, I was probably a fair way away from this decision, but gone are the days when security sits in an ivory tower and dictates you must, and owns all of the risks associated with cybersecurity. The actions and the risks, I think, in a lot of cases lie with the development teams. And by embedding cybersecurity resources further into the development teams and the development lifecycle, it makes it more likely that these types of issues are surfaced and addressed when they're actually being built, rather than at the mandatory waterfall meeting at the end to get security sign off before we press the big red button. So it's something that I've seen a lot of companies doing, embedding project resources and permanent resources within development teams. And yeah, personally, I think it's a really good move.
Do you see this as an ongoing thing where it makes a lot of sense to go through this process of, going through a coding boot camp for someone who might want to go into cloud security? Like, do you see the way you went into this career, like, is it something you would, hope a lot of other organizations are doing more and more of? Because it is unique in that sense, right? Like, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it is unique. There are some programs out there that I've heard of. I think Microsoft did some work around upskilling people and then placing them at their clients. I think Accenture did something similar. So it's not, we're not sitting out there on our lonesome.
Yeah.
I think the thing about cloud security engineering is that it's so broad. Well, even if you take the engineering component out of it and you just look at cloud
Hmm.
security, it is so broad.
Hmm.
And the opportunity to create different ways of thinking by bringing people in with different backgrounds, I think can only serve to benefit the shared goal of what's being trying to achieve. And when you've got to communicate with so many different groups of stakeholders that have different perspectives, having
Hmm.
differing perspectives within the team as opposed to everyone viewing things through the same cookie cutter lens,
Hmm.
I think, yeah, can only benefit what it is that, or the message that's being trumpeted by the team.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge, like as organizations want more quote unquote cloud security engineers, engineers, right? They're basically developers with a cloud security focus. Um, okay, I want to take a quick pivot here. So we talked a little bit about the lens about how do you talk about security to the business and to the BAUs, and we talked a lot about quantifying the risk, but does it really boil down to saying, this security issue will cost us X amount of dollars? Because is that really what it quantifies down to? Or like, are there dimensions here as other dimensions that we should be factoring as well when you talk about quantifying risk to businesses?
I think in most cases,
Hmm.
the money component may not be the initial driver, but it might be the end one. So, if you were to look at something like availability, and you
Yeah.
sort of talk about the
Mm.
CIA triad, although availability itself isn't an inherent money driver as such, the reputational damage and the loss of money that comes with not being available, the the um, the end users that end up going to your competitor that's inherently more reliable as a result. I think money is always easy to
Hmm.
have people relate to because it's cold, hard, and in ones and zeros. I think it can be a lot more challenging to relate to business users with what they find important when
Hmm.
it's a little bit more fluffy and a little bit more emotional.
It, it's a topic that we have internally, so I'll share you a little bit here. Like, we've heard some horror stories of people deploying infrastructure, using something like Terraform, right, for example,
Mm.
um, and they accidentally destroy a database, right?
Yeah,
uh, that's availability, right? And the
yeah,
question we have internally is that not a security issue? Because we always talk about security as ransomware, as something being insecure, as vulnerabilities in a container, as someone being able to gain root access, right?
mm.
We always talk about security in that lens, and availability is kind of this. Yeah, we need to make sure the services are available, but that's kind of other people's problems, and it's
Yeah,
an interesting. It's not fair, right? You're absolutely, in my opinion, I think that's something that security should also own, because you know every time you're introducing ways to address security issues, you also need to factor in, does this make our services more or less available, and or what are the implications of that? Or how do we look at risk and quantify availability as part of the risk? That's actually a really interesting topic. I mean, you see a lot of DDoS providers talk about it like that, right? They talk about
yeah.
when you're DDoS, you're losing X amount per second, you're down. But beyond that, I mean, it is important to weigh availability into this. Okay. So I want to dive into something else, and it's kind of a buzzword, but hopefully we can unpack it a bit. Um, GitOps, right?
Yeah,
You might have heard about it. Um, what are your thoughts? Let's start there.
yeah, yeah, sure. So, in the interest of speaking the same language as I
Yes.
understand GitOps, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, or we can carry on if I'm sort of barking up the right tree, so to speak.
Yep.
GitOps is sort of being the extension to CI/CD, where you're looking at your Git repository and your code repository as being your quote unquote single source of truth. Sorry, buzzword bingo. And operating in a declarative sense. And so what that means is that when we say we're going to have a VPC and it's going to have 2 subnets in it, that the observability piece that is constantly feeding back to those mechanisms to say, do we have a VPC in place with 2 subnets? Yes or no? And if we don't, change it. Is that what you understand GitOps to be, Charles?
Yeah. So yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's all right. Is that what you understand GitOps to be? Because I've seen a few definitions roaming around the interweb, and every man and his dog seems to have an opinion on this one.
Yeah. It's funny. I feel like GitOps is becoming like DevOps, where I mean, initially DevOps everyone had so many different opinions about what it meant. It'll be interesting once the dust settles, but I have a very similar definition in very broad terms. You tightly couple your tooling to your CI/CD, because CI/CD is a concept. It's not a implementation recommendations, right? Like it doesn't say you must use GitHub, you must use Jenkins, you must use these tools, and you must put together your pipeline in a certain way for it to be CI/CD. It just says these are the objectives you must accomplish with your tooling as CI/CD, right? I think GitOps is, in my opinion, trying to take it a step further and saying, well, yes, there are some opinions about it effectively, but you can technically tightly couple a lot of these things because the source of truth should be your GitHub, right? Because your tools rely on webhooks or rely on triggers that are related to Git actions or Git behaviors. And I think part of it also is taking a step further is, and this is where it's interesting because, the people that originally created the definition of GitOps focused on Kubernetes and focused on how you look at Kubernetes and using GitHub or any sort of SCM provider as a source of truth for deploying and orchestrating any changes in your environment. But that applies to everything, when it comes to software practices. And if I were to abstract it with GitOps, I would say any sort of infrastructure should try to follow this model, right? It doesn't matter what language you use, it doesn't matter what technologies you're using. It should be all things related to infrastructure. The challenge I have is like, we're introducing more terminology into the buzzword soup, right?
Yep.
DevOps and GitOps, right?
If they start doing DevSecOps, I'll be very annoyed. if they throw that in there. I mean, granted, you can jack your pay up by about 25, 30K, so that's not all bad, but that's where we're heading.
I mean, it's an interesting topic because, like, where do you draw the line of what's DevOps versus what's GitOps? Because GitOps just seems like a application of class DevOps.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's I sort of see it as a bit of a subset, and I think that there are a lot of organizations that have reached the level of maturity where a lot of their infrastructure is generated out of their Git repository, and a lot of it is built around the merge requests and the approvals and the automated steps in order to push it out. Where I think GitOps takes it that step further is that tied back observability piece to say, is this what we expect? Is this state? And then doing something about it if it's not. And for other companies that maybe haven't reached that level of maturity, it's a deployment of their environment using infrastructure as code, be it Terraform or CloudFormation or Pulumi or what have you. and either restraining teams' ability to mess with that baseline environment that they've put down, or alternatively just asking people nicely not to touch it. And so you're always going to have sort of this spectrum of maturity of teams and where they're at. But I think broadly, people are, getting on the infrastructure as code train. In doing so, that does create just a basic requirement for infrastructure developers and security developers to be able to write infrastructure as code as well. Because unfortunately, for a lot of these teams, ClickOps, through the GUI doesn't align with where the industry is going and where that's being taken.
Oh man, I've never heard of that term, ClickOps. That's hilarious.
It's a good one. I give it
Yeah.
to you.
Yeah, I'm going to be using that one a lot. Okay. Two questions. One more related to how you guys are handling, your GitOps stack. But the other thing I want to talk about is like, we focus on the rosy picture of GitOps. GitHub should be a source of truth. But you touched on this, right? You said, depending on your maturity, you now need to think about things like don't touch your infrastructure, don't touch the code, or don't deploy elsewhere, right? And something that I think it's not very, and I think in the real world people talk about it all the time, but something we don't advertise or talk a lot about when it comes to GitOps is reconciling with drifts, reconciling with people with all these different workflows, and then now trying to consolidate into one, right? And that's problematic because, I mean, even within an organization, there's a lot of use cases why everyone needs their own pipeline, needs their own flows. Like, how do you, what's your opinion about how do you handle or how do you reconcile all these differences, right? Like, I mean, a very simple example is someone might have a rogue Ansible script running regularly, and it makes API calls directly to your AWS environment, and it changes something, and it's outside of your infrastructure as code, right? Okay, well, what then, right? How do you handle that?
With great difficulty. It's never going to be an easy fix, and unfortunately, or fortunately, you've got to weigh up what the pros are of going with a centralized model where you've got this secure pipeline versus giving teams the autonomy to be able to build their own pipelines. Because if you're responsible for creating a bottleneck, then you've got to wear whatever delays that are as a result of that bottleneck. In enterprises, I think inevitably you're going to have a spectrum of maturity, and you're always going to have teams that are doing things slightly differently to one another, no matter how aligned you are. And if you go down the shared pipeline approach, you've either got to bring your slowest walker up or your fastest walker down. And so I think that's always going to make things challenging going down that path.
Yeah, I've never heard it said that way, but that's actually an interesting approach or perspective on it. Like it's really hard to standardize because it does impact productivity to some degree, and so you need to weigh that cost. I mean, it is a cost, right? Productivity, or reduced productivity. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, my second question is, well, then how do you guys handle it, right? And you don't have to share, you don't have to divulge into the entire stack, but at a higher level, how do you guys handle this strategy around GitOps?
Yeah, sure. So given that I work predominantly in AWS, I've used CloudFormation pretty extensively. The issues with CloudFormation are around the ability to create different aspects of the same CloudFormation template. And so we use something called CFN DSL, which is a Ruby-based language that sits over the top of us that enables us to give a layer of flexibility to what it is that we're deploying. So we can write one template that we deploy to dev, test, and prod, or to account A versus account B, and it gives us that layer of abstraction. As far as the management is concerned of the templates themselves, we use GitLab CI/CD with runners in order to carry out and deploy these actions. And like I said before, that there's always going to be a spectrum of teams with different levels of maturity. I think the same can be said for, products that I've worked on. Something, your Rolls-Royce product that you're releasing, your pipeline's going to be top notch, either because the business demands it or because of the amount that you're releasing there, versus the 2-week POC. It's going to be held together with duct tape and bamboo, but it's just got to get it out there. And so I think the same can be said with a lot of teams' pipelines as well.
I love that analogy, and it brings to light, like, not all pipelines need to be treated equal. And it boils down to how the business values the services it's maintaining, right? I really like that analogy. Sorry, I just wanted to comment on that. Okay, so again, thank you so much for sharing that. I want to take this a different angle here, and we're going to go more higher level and not talk about the technical, or maybe we can explore it. But given what you've seen so far now with a year plus of cloud security under your belt, and then with the organization you've been working with, what are some of the general recommendations you have? Getting into cloud security, and then, obviously there's like a maturity model of what cloud security should be. If you have nothing, no tooling, nothing in place, then you kind of need to start on step one. But what are the things you're starting to see now that we're not talking about, and we should start looking into more? And then how would you express this to the business as something that needs to be looked at?
Yep. Okay. That's a big old question, but I'll do my best. I think at a high level, and it's I don't mean for this to sound arrogant, but given sort of the success that my colleagues have been able to achieve, I look at a program like this and I think, why aren't more organizations doing it? And I think time will tell, but it'll be really interesting to see in 5 years what bringing people from different backgrounds and diverse views, where they will end up. And listening to some of the achievements of my colleagues in the 2.5 years that we've been at our organization now, I'll be really curious to see where people end up. So I think hiring and having an open mind to diversity is probably the first thing that I look at, not just for security and cloud security, but I think more generally. Investment in the basics and talking about the boring stuff of cloud security. It's not sexy. It's never going to be sexy. 0 days, dominate news articles, but unfortunately it's going to be password 123 that is the result of 95% of these hacks. And so I think building out a really strong end user education program is going to be really fundamental to keeping enterprises secure. And it doesn't matter how good your alerting or monitoring is and your blue team is, if people are constantly leaving the gate open, a sheep's going to get out eventually. And so I think that's the other component that needs to be really, really trumpeted. And I think when people think of cloud security, they get too drawn into the sexy engineering work without thinking about the education component that goes into that. And that's both of you know, sort of day-to-day business users of, you know, the people in HR and the people in accounting, you know, all the way through to the developers themselves, and making sure that they have the right skills and tools to develop securely on the cloud, because it's enormous. You look at AWS and there's over 200 services. There's God only knows how many API calls. No one can be expected to be an expert in all of this. And so having a really robust education program, I think, goes a long way to stopping blue team burnout to a certain extent, and a lot of these attacks in their tracks.
I lots of things to unpack there. Just to follow up, and I want to have a couple more questions. Sorry, I realize we just have 5 minutes, but how do you express this to the business? Like things like improving end user education. I'll be honest. Like, I think it's very hard to, at scale, teach what phishing is, right? And what things to look out for. For example, as a very simple example, or that the secrets that you're passing into when your config files and is stored in a and is viewable from a Git commit, right? That's not okay, right? Like, those are things kind of hard to do at scale. Like, if you need to, for example, have a developer run an additional command right before they run, they push their code. What are your thoughts about this, right? Like, it's hard it's a hard balance of productivity versus effectiveness of actually getting people to be educated. Where do you get that balance?
It's, you hit the nail on the head. It's hard. And I don't know that there is a silver bullet out there.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of organizations that go down the security champions path that goes a long way to sort of helping that, of embedding not necessarily security resources in teams, but people who are passionate about these types of programs. And as far as sort of the quantification of these education programs, it's just another plate of armor. And it needs to be viewed in the same way that an investment in a next generation firewall is viewed, in the same way that your new vulnerability management scanning tool is. It's just another layer of defense that we have against other people trying to do malicious things.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, and then last thing here is how would you bring this up to the business, to the BAU? Like, let's use, for example, a secret scanning tool in the GitHub repo, and you tell the BAU, we need to implement this for your developers. They're going to be alerted if we find something in your GitHub repo. They need to address it. Let's use that as an example. How do you convince the BAU for that? And I'm sure you guys probably did something like this already, but yeah.
Yeah. And I'll put the caveat to this with it's not an area that I've worked extensively across. We do have another team that specializes in this area, but it's about demonstrating value and about demonstrating how putting these tools at the forefront of the cycle can lead to reduced lead times, as opposed to when we find it at the end and we just have to rework your entire sprint because you've done the wrong thing. So if we can shorten that feedback loop and give development teams the opportunity to own their own security risks, own their own vulnerabilities, and call them out faster, that will lead to faster release times.
Got it. Okay. Awesome. Thank you for that. We have 2 minutes left, but I think I just kind of want to open the table or open the floor for you. And, any last minute advice for anyone who wants to get into cloud security? What are the things you might want to you would recommend for them to look into? Yeah, leave it there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a heap of resources online. I've already touched on, how good the cloud security market is at sharing their knowledge. Twitter can be really difficult to navigate at first, and there's a lot of interesting comments that go on, but once you curate sort of the right list of followers, it becomes a really invaluable repository of knowledge. There's some great podcasts out there that I listen to on a daily basis that I can, perhaps put in the comments section or something like that for people to look through. There's newsletters like TLDRSec, which is a great curated list of all things security, and cloud security frequently features within that. So it just comes down to how you learn best, I guess. Flaws.io, which is a vulnerable AWS account that was created by Scott Piper, teaches you offensive cloud security engineering skills. That can be a great way to sort of put your red team hat on that we were sort of talking about earlier. Yeah, there's so much out there. And if you're not sure, just ask. There are people who are more than willing to point you in the right direction or have a chat.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ben. I really appreciate this. We're at the top of the hour. I'll be providing your LinkedIn on the YouTube channel. So if anyone wants to reach out for advice, they can. Hopefully no vendor solicitation. So I do apologize if they come your way, Ben, but you know what? Thank you so much. There's actually lots of different bits of wisdom that I got personally. Thinking about how the business values a product and how that impacts what you do for tooling around it is very, very enlightening. How the business looks at, what you measure as a security implementation, also very, very valuable for me. I think the aspect about how we need to kind of think outside of the box now about how you want to introduce more cloud security engineering is really, really fascinating, because in this topic, I mean, the reality is, like, the talent pool is kind of niche. There are very few people who can do what you're doing, for example. How organizations need to really challenge themselves to think about that problem. It's a very fascinating topic. So anyways, Ben, thank you so much for all of this. This will be available for anyone who wants to listen to the recording later on, but yeah, again, pleasure. And I know it's late for you, so I won't hold you back anymore.
That's all right, mate.
Enjoy your beer.
Thanks. Will do. Cheers. Enjoy yours as well.
Too early for me, but thank